All right, everyone got really quiet while we were talking about going to the bathroom. So. Sorry about that, but we were just saying that was actually a totally appropriate way to start the panel. So we're gonna start, even though we do have one person that we want to make sure you're introduced to, who will probably walk in the middle of the introduction. So I just wanted to say, by the way, I'm Johanna Burton. I'm the Keith Haring Director and Curator of Education and Public Engagement here at the New Museum. And I was absolutely delighted when Carlos, we met to talk about a few things, and when I learned that he was looking for a place to launch this project in its many aspects, we sat and had a conversation about what that would look like. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with Gender Talents, we'll talk about it in a moment more fully, but I'll just say that we're here to celebrate the launch of this web-based project that engages movements and discourses for gender self-determination within trans and intersex communities internationally. It was particularly nice to invite him to do this at the New Museum because, as many of you probably know, a fantastic project happened here initiated by Unji Ju in 2012 called We Who Feel Differently on the 5th floor. Again, a really expansive project. And I feel like it was a lot of the thinking that went into that project also is evidenced here. This event will feature a screening of selected video portraits drawn from the project, and of course you can also spend a lot of time afterwards looking at more of those. And I think very wonderfully a conversation that's, I think, going to take on a lot of different topics between Carlos, legendary author Kate Bornstein, intersex activist and sex therapist Tiger DeVore, who actually came all the way from Las Vegas to be with us today, so I'm delighted about that. Queer studies scholar Tavia Nyong'o and artist Tara Maddock, and I'm just going to have a 10-minute conversation to sort of kick this off and set the stage, and then move away. We also are really lucky to have Galilea Bracho, who's in the front row here, and she's going to join for the conversation at the end. She's came in last night or the night before from Guatemala, and I think will be a fantastic addition. So she's also part of this conversation today. So again, a small bit of framing, and then I'll pose a few questions to Carlos. We'll awkwardly look at each other. But Gender Talents features an online archive of video portraits of trans and intersex activists who thoughtfully perform gender as a personal, social, and political opportunity rather than as a social condemnation. Using in-depth interviews conducted with jogappa and trans communities in India, sex workers in Colombia and Guatemala, and intersex activists in the United States, Gender Talents documents the ways in which society conditions and regulates bodies, and how gender activists build politics of resistance and action. Of specific concern is how individuals and organizations fight for state recognition, access to work and health benefits, and the right to self-determine their identities and self-govern their bodies, among other pressing issues. It's also, and we'll talk about this a bit, an ongoing platform for physical events, including this one, that reflect on alternative ways to think about the rigid nature of the gender binaries. It continues to be enforced in society. And Carlos has actually broken down a number of topics that I'm just going to point out, dissecting the gender binary intersectionalities in global queer, trans, and intersex activism, self-representation, and art and culture. So we'll get to the bottom of all of those in the next hour and a half, I think. But let's start off, actually, Carlos, by, if you wouldn't mind, talking, before we get into the nuts and bolts, about the title of Gender Talents. What is the title? What does it mean? How did you come up with it?
Gender Talents refers to the work of trans activist from Norway called Esben Ester Pirelli Benestad, who is somebody I interviewed for the work that I presented here in 2012 called We Who Feel Differently. And so the core of Esben Ester's work, who's primarily working as a sex therapist in Norway, is to depathologize ideas about gender and to get rid of negative connotations in favor of positive descriptions and denominations. So the question of talent is something that Esben Ester thinks about in opposition to the question of disorder, which is the way that trans persons have been labeled by psychiatry and the medical discourse many times. So Esben Ester was interested in this idea that in Esben Ester's opinion, performing gender is a question of a talent, is something that some other people are not able to see, and hence there is this question of a performance that transcends the denominations that have been normatively imposed upon their bodies. So in conversation with Esben Esther, here has been talking about the ways in which just changing in language could have a very strong repercussion in the way that people can think of their own identities and represent themselves. And it became important as an idea to reflect upon in the context of gender talents. And one of the chapters of the publication, which I actually edited with my sister, who is in the audience today, Cristina, we decided to call it that way because it was a very strong and poignant declaration, if you will. And upon completing that work, I realized that it was such an important topic that it demanded its own project. And that's what this project is. It's kind of a continuation of the work that I had developed then, but it took about 3.5 years in the making. And also thinking about different communities that are often not represented in global discourses of the mainstream discourse regarding trans and intersex questions. So that's what the project was. Yeah.
I love that title, and it always makes me think about gender trouble and the way in which at a certain moment the idea of trouble got sort of inserted culturally so that we could understand, again, how to disrupt culture. But then there is this sort of redoubling through talent that has such a nice way of thinking about the extraordinary in a positive way, and in a way that people, I think of talent as everyone's always admiring of talent. So I thought it was a really a beautiful title, and I liked how you linked it back to some of the previous work by others in the field as well. Can you talk about how you structured your research in the field, and then how it came into the various forms that it did over time? I know you've been working on it for a long time.
Right. Well, thankfully, through We Who Feel Differently, I had a chance to work already with people like Tiger or Esben Esther and a couple of other people that became very influential for its making. And so I remember early on, as We Who Feel Differently was being, as I finished it, I met with Tiger at a diner in Chelsea, and I told him about this project that I had in mind and asked some questions, because of course I have to say I don't identify myself as trans, and I'm not intersex. So I wanted to make sure that this project would be something that was done responsibly. Speaking about these questions of self-representation and representation, I knew that I could contribute something by the experience I had had with previous work before, but also because I thought that I could construct a discourse and kind of fill a hole in terms of making a project that would approach the questions even if it was not my own personal experience. So I made sure that I was getting advice from people like Tiger and other people to start with. And then I started to identify that there were certain areas, like for instance, the work of Red Mutrans in Guatemala, for example, which is a nascent organization for trans sex workers that has very little infrastructure, both physical or discursive, and how the project could contribute to perhaps bringing to light the work that some of these activists are doing, and is often not documented because of the lack of those very resources. So that's how the project started going. I think the project also could be much bigger, but unfortunately I just did what I could do, especially as it pertains to the question of intersex activism, which I think it only just scratches the surface of in terms of the people that could have been involved and the videos that could have been produced, but hopefully it just kind of points to an absence in spite, and probably you will speak about this later, Tiger, but in spite of certain documentaries and certain films that have been made on the topic, I think there's really a lack of a substantial project of documentation of the work that they have been doing. So that was kind of like the initiative, was like, point to things that are perhaps in the radar but not so widely documented, and create a project of documentation that could become potentially a resource for studying this kind of work. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about the sort of geographical specificity. Maybe we can get to that through some of the conversations around art and activism, but maybe you could also, since I want to quickly move to your introducing everyone on the panel, can you explain, in addition to the website and the book, what the previous iterations of public programs have been?
Sure. The project began after an invitation from Electra Productions in London in collaboration with the Tate Modern, where they asked me to do a project. And I was in the process of thinking about beginning this, and I thought that it would be nice to bring a group of practitioners together to think about the ways in which such a project could be structured. So it became really important early on to think about physical meetings of activists and artists, academics, and so on, to think about these topics collectively. So the first project was a project called Gender Talents, a Special Address, where about 12 people were invited to deliver manifesto-like presentations at the Tate Tanks in London, at the Tate Modern, and it became also a platform, a kind of like a very performative platform to think about this kind of gathering, also not in such conventional terms as like what we're doing now, where there is a presentation of panelists, a conversation, but actually engage the space and the audience with different less normative structures, if you will.
Sure.
So that's what that project was. The second one, which was very significant both for myself but also for Red Mutrans in Guatemala, was when we presented the project, initially the videos that we did with Red Mutrans at the Centro Cultural de España, the Spanish Cultural Center, where Galilea very intensely organized a project where she invited transgender indigenous women from different parts of Guatemala and sex workers and other trans activists to gather and kind of occupy a space that has traditionally not included their bodies. So through the infrastructure of the biennial, the Guatemala biennial, and kind of like the validation of me being an artist with some recognition, we managed to kind of occupy that space in a way that was really fantastic. It kind of like really pierced the ways in which these communities have been excluded from those cultural spaces.
Right.
Les estoy diciendo del evento que organizamos contigo en el Centro Cultural de España.
That's great. And then this iteration of the public program.
Camilo, tú te podrías sentar con Galilea.
Will bring together sort of aspects from both of those, both angles, I think, to some degree. So just so you all know what to expect in the next hour and a half or so, what I think will happen, what I know will happen, because we talked about it, is I'll now turn this over to Carlos. He's going to tell you not just who these people are, but why he felt they were important to speak on this topic. And then there will be a short screening of 4 different profiles or portraits. Yeah, I keep calling them profiles, but they're not. They're portraits. And then there will be a discussion in between where some of the topics that I already mentioned and the panelists have been prepped for, they'll discuss. And then Galilea, you'll come sit up here after these presentations, and there will be a conversation between the panelists and all of you in the audience. So with that, again, I couldn't be more grateful and excited about the day. So thanks to all of you in advance. Now I'm going to go sit over there.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I know that it's beautiful outside and probably we would all rather be sunbathing, but I appreciate the effort of being here. And especially to the guests that have accepted the invitation. I want to start actually by introducing Galilea Bracho, the person we've been talking about. Galilea, ¿te puedes parar para que te vean? Galilea is the founding director of Red Mutrans, which is the multicultural network of trans women in Guatemala. And it's a particularly special organization in the sense that it's an organization that is looking at multiculturalism as the center of their work. So it's an organization that is for the first time recognizing the existence and the inclusion of trans women of indigenous descent, African descent, etc., that are working in Guatemala, which is mostly a field dominated by sex work and also work as stylist and things of the sort. So Galilea, I had the kind of chance of meeting Galilea, who has become a very important part of my life in the last few years. And Galilea is a very determined and driven person that managed to find sponsorship to come to this event because she considered it would be important for her to be here in spite of my impossibility to pay for that. So EVOS and UNAIDS have paid Galilea's trip. So gracias Galilea por estar acá. Y después, afterwards, if anyone has any questions for Galilea, you can address them to her here and probably Camilo or myself will translate. Estoy diciendo que cuando pasemos después puedes venir a responder unas preguntas y hacemos traducción. And to the very right is legendary author Kate Bornstein. It's really a pleasure to have you here, Kate. As I was, I don't know, so many years ago actually, even before thinking about this project, I found a quote in your book, Gender Outlaw, that I wanted to read as a kind of setup for the panel.
Sure.
Yeah. So Kate was writing, "Why in the world are we hanging on to gender and to our gender systems? I heard once why is not a spiritual question. Perhaps not. But it is a political question, and politics seem to be as good a step as any on the road to spirituality. Given any binary, it's fun to look for a hidden third, and the reason why the third was hidden says a lot about culture. The choice between two of something is not a choice at all, but rather the opportunity to subscribe to the value system which holds the two presented choices as mutually exclusive alternatives. Once we choose one or the other, we've bought into the system that perpetuates the binary. I supported those rules in order to belong, or rather, not to be an outsider, a non-belonger." And I found that I wanted to bring up this quote again as a setup for this event, because I think that it's very important to understand, especially for myself and others, that we are all implicated in questions of gender politics, even if we don't experience the experience of having a non-normative expression of gender. We are all complicitly buying into the ways in which society has structured gender in very specific binary terms, which I think is ultimately the basis of this project and perhaps of all of you guys' or most of you guys' work. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted you to be here, was to acknowledge the profound work that you have done in the past and the contribution to gender theory and also to the lives of people that are grappling with gender normativity, but also those that aren't, like myself in a sense, but continue to be inspired by the kind of intrinsic subversive politics that you have opened up for them. Having said that, Kate is also the author of My Gender Workbook, How to Become a Real Man, a Real Woman, the Real You, or Something Else Entirely, from 1998. And recently A Queer and Pleasant Danger, a memoir from 2012. And has been greatly, that's enough. To my right is Tiger DeVore, who is, as Johanna and I mentioned before, a sex therapist and an intersex activist that has been greatly inspiring also for me as I've been working on these couple of projects dealing with these topics. Tiger has been a very outspoken activist that has appeared on many media channels, including The Today Show, Oprah, Dr. Oz, Montel, Sally and Lisa, and documentaries for Discovery Channel, PBS, National Geographic Television, New Zealand State Television, TLC, and BBC. And I have to say that it's really a pleasure to have you again, Tiger, because your contribution to We Who Feel Differently really kind of shapes the project for me. I think it's at the core of the work. To my left here is Tavia Nyong'o. Did I do it right? I was very nervous about the pronunciation. Tavia is was born in Kenya, but has been living in New York for and is Associate Professor of Performance Studies at NYU, where he writes, researches, and teaches critical Black studies, queer studies, cultural theory, and cultural history. His first book, The Amalgamation Waltz, Race, Performance, and the Roses of Memory from 2009, won the Errol Hill Award for Best Book in African American Theater and Performance Studies. He has published articles on punk, disco, viral media, the African diaspora, film, and performance art. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And Tara Matei is somebody I have known for a very long time here in New York, an artist colleague whose work I really, really admire. In his videos, Tara has videos, performances, and installation. Tara has created critical reenactments that underscores movements of collective trans feminism across historical and geographic locations. Tara works with queer iconography to explore the ways in which history is written on and by actual bodies. Performing with other gender non-conforming bodies, his work is intended to disrupt expectations, to present the imaginable as real, and to generate new political potentialities. In essence, to pervert the audiovisual archive. Tara's work, and this is a quote from Tara's website, so this is something presumably you have written. Tara's videos are distributed by the Video Data Bank and have been exhibited at PS1 MoMA, the Guggenheim, the Kitchen, Overhouse Short Film Festival, and many other places throughout the world. And so with that, I think we can start maybe the presentations. I wanted to, as Johanna was saying, instead of invite each one of them to give a formal presentation, have a slightly different format, which is that of an open conversation. But to do that, I wanted to propose using some of the videos from Gender Talent's Portraits Archive as points of departure for the conversation. So the first video that we will screen is a video by intersex activist David Iris Cameron, who is based in San Francisco, which will be opening up our conversation for questions of the gender binary. So maybe we can... Thank you.
It is only fairly recently that I have discovered the term intersex and how it relates to my body. I like the term because I prefer more choices than male or female. I think there is a continuum of male to female, like shades of gray from black to white. It wasn't until I was 29 years old that a label was put on my physical differences that I never quite understood. I had large nipples on small breasts, peanut-sized testicles, and cellulite-type hairless fatty tissue over most of my body. I was told at an infertility clinic that I had an extra X chromosome and a karyotype of XXY47, known as Klinefelter syndrome. My legal name is David Cameron Strachan. When I was 15 and I was in high school biology, I saw a picture of a giant, and it said giants are usually sterile, and that always stuck in my head. I always kind of struggled with my gender identity. I dated men and women, because I thought at the time that's all there were. I just thought there was men who were male and women who were female, and then there was me, and I kind of felt I wasn't sure, what I was. I had come to see myself as intersex, whereas before I'd been told that I had an anomaly, or I was a mutation, or it was all negative. I think our culture is so genderized, stereotypically so, that even the most gendered male or gendered female is almost a myth. At some point, you have a sense of who you are. Like for me, I say that I'm sexless and genderless. I'm an energy form, and I just wear a body. But I present this way because it's easy, and I can get away with it. You know, I mean, I'm 7 feet tall when I walk down the street, and I don't want any more attention that I already get. In between is just sort of a blending of masculine and feminine qualities. I mean, I'm not ashamed to say that I have feminine qualities. I embrace my femininity or my androgyny. I actually feel more uncomfortable with my masculinity. You know, I mean, I look really masculine and you know, I scare a lot of people on the street, but I'm really a teddy bear inside. So, well, this is just a picture of me in my androgynous body, at least my upper body. And then the next picture is me 20 years later, my gorilla suit. And it's quite a shock. But all my lovers have loved it, so I think it's this one.
In New Zealand, a child is born every 8 minutes, and the first question we ask, is it a boy or a girl? What if it's neither?
What if it's just a healthy baby? Wouldn't that be nice?
Intersex?
I think when a child's born, it has to not be a social emergency to do any surgery on their genitals. So parents have to be educated. Doctors have to be educated. And if a child comes through that experience intact and learns who they are, how they identify, hopefully that would be good. I think it would be really nice if children weren't defined by their sex organs, but were more defined by what they bring to the planet, what their gifts are. And then parents could celebrate that. I think all of us have a life to live, and we need to live it the best way we can. My understanding is younger generations tend to be a little more fluid in their sexuality and their gender, and that's really cool. And I'm not really sure where the younger generation's going to take us, take themselves. You know, I'm not going to be here forever. I mean, I feel very fortunate that I've made it to 65 when I didn't think I'd live to be 50. I thought AIDS would have killed me by now. It hasn't. And my goal is to have my memoirs done by the time I'm 70. That's 5 years to write my book. And I'm writing it. I'm discovering day by day, what do I want each day? You know, I want peace of mind. I want a loving partner. You know, those are things that are important to me. What people do behind me, they'll just create what they create.
I just wanted to kind of pose a question to everyone. Maybe, Tiger, you can start because since this seems to be your topic in a way. I'm interested in sort of like the recognition that the gender binary is a kind of tyrannical structure that is, and the way that it is, as I mentioned earlier, kind of ingrained in every aspect of society, from institutions to family relations to language and so on. So I'm just curious about the ways in which you think that what are the alternatives or the potentials to pierce through the ways in which the binary has been structured, and maybe from the experience of the work that you have done, but also in a kind of potential imagination of the changing of that landscape.
Okay. I don't know how long you want me to speak, but I'll do the best I can.
Well,
So,
not so long that way we have.
okay. So, David's a person with 47 chromosomes. Human beings are supposed to have 46. And as I was speaking with somebody earlier today, now, through amniocentesis, everybody who has David's difference could be eliminated before birth. And my interest is in not seeing intersex people eliminated from the planet. I was born, not like David, but I was born with ambiguous genitalia. And genitalia can come out male or female or something in between. Intersex or hermaphrodites does not mean we have both sets. We just have something female or male or something in between. So ambiguous genitalia means it's kind of a mix of things, right? That's how I was born. I've had 24 genital surgeries. First surgery was age 3 months. Last surgery was a month ago. And I don't want to have had any of those surgeries. I want the genitals that I was born with. But because of the gender binary and because of the rules we have about everything has to be male or female, at age 3 months, my parents allowed me to be chopped up by some surgeons who had no idea what they were doing in 1958. And they have caused me to have many, many more surgeries throughout my entire life term. So I'd like to see no surgeries. I'd like to see there be a place for intersex people, intersex children, to exist as intersex. And that's what I've been on TV and radio, even with Howard Stern, and in magazines and all over the internet, trying to get people to understand that intersex is a part of every species on this planet. Intersex has always been there. As far as I can tell, intersex will always be there. And we need to be allowed to exist. This is the most important thing.
What about you, Kate? Is there, I mean, a lot of the work that you have done, as the quote that I mentioned, is already, stressing the importance of thinking of alternatives.
In the last couple of years, there's been a rise in this notion of non-binary gender, to the point where a survey was done, the massive millennial survey, done by Fusion.com and the Huffington Post a couple of months ago. And they surveyed millennials, 1,000 folks between 18 and 32, all over this country, just in this country. But all races, ideologies, rural, urban, blah, blah, blah. Fully 50% of the respondents believe that gender is not one or the other, but rather a spectrum. And that's startling. I don't know why that wasn't on the front page of the New York Times, because trying to unseat the notion of two and two only has been a hell of a job, and it's already been unseated, apparently.
What about you, Tara? I mean, a lot of the work that you have been doing has also been dealing with the ways in which cultural representation, pop culture deals with the kind of ingrained ideas about gender. Can you talk to this?
Sure. First, I'll just say that one tool I use is the male pronoun, because you're talking a lot about the language. I don't identify as male, I don't identify as female. So one way to articulate gender, and I use this as a tool, I started using this as a tool in 2002 or 2003, I forget, when I was in grad school, but I wasn't getting really good critique. And a lot of the reason was because people are like, what, so you're gay? So what, are you lesbian? And I'm like, I'm not a lesbian, but I'm not that point is I need a critique that includes not just sexuality, but gender. So how about if I use the name I was given, I was Tara, and then you use male pronouns for me, and let's see if that can help. And it did help to retrain people to be able to see the work differently. However, Kate, you were talking about how surveying the millennials and like what kind of answers. I think that I believe that, but I don't know that our behavior is caught up, and that perhaps they're reading. Yeah. Okay. So I want to, do I have time to tell you about one? Okay. So I'm in grad school, and I'm like, my peers are starting to catch up, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do this project for this organization, the Society of Biological Insurgents. It was post 9/11, and a lot of us were being lumped into terrorist activity. What I did was replace 30 bathroom stickers, male and female, with images of a gynandromorph fly and a crepidulous snail. In gynandromorph flies, the left side of the body, or one side of the body, is explicitly male, and the other is female. And in crepidulous snails, they're able to change their sex depending where they are in a pile. We've all been there, right? So male. So male and female was replaced. It was an art project. I went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and it is essentially married to the military. That also paid for my art degree. However, the response I was expecting, the critique was great. It just was not what I was expecting. And at the same time, I was trying to get gender on the Student Bill of Rights for protection. And at this time, this is how the university responded. Long story short, I was able to get we put telephone numbers on there and said, you had been toilet trained, please contact this number. A lot of people contact this number. A lot of people hung up. Public safety did not, and they showed up they traced the number and showed up with this report. Here's a few things that I think point to the anxiety that people have when you question the binary. Rensselaer has no more immunity to being a landing place of violence or terrorism than any other place in the U.S. Theodore Kaczynski, spelled incorrectly, had his first mail bomb addressed to RPI. And then, erring on the side of ultra caution, the response could have gone even further, evacuating the building, sealing the area, activating the county emergency services team, decontaminating personnel, dealing with a host of media inquiries, campus-wide paranoia, and so forth. Besides the inconveniencing of some persons who abided by the reassignment or just opted not to take the chance either way, it actually caused real anxiety. Thank you. That's what I thought. So the anxiety around interfering with the binary is interesting to me, and I do agree that, like, oh yeah, we're starting to change the language and people are starting to wear it differently and there's more visibility, but I often wonder if that's within my insular community, and I think that can extend beyond, but I think there's a lot of anxiety still out there, but I do think that we're moving forward. Oh, and one thing I can tell you guys, and this is one thing that I find really helpful, is when you don't know, and I don't know if this is an audience I should be speaking with, but I often have to ask people, like, what is your preferred gender pronoun? And then they tell me. And then I say, okay, we're about to go into this meeting. I don't pass. Please use male pronouns excessively for me throughout the meeting. And if someone does it incorrectly, I can't say anything because I'm gonna be shaming them if I say he. So could you please, in the next sentence, say, Tara, wow, he looks good today. I like that color on him. Where did he go? Follow? So you just help your peers by correcting them in the next sentence. So please feel free to do that with me as well. I use male.
One of the things that is important, I think, in the conversation is to locate these discourses here and elsewhere. And I think from the perspective of your work, from a queer studies perspective, of course, the question of the fluidity of gender is kind of at the core of the reading of constituencies and communities and locations. But I was wondering if you could speak to the question of gender as it is perhaps enacted in other places that are not hegemonic centers of discourse, like it could be Europe or the United States, but elsewhere. In the work that you have done dealing with the African diaspora, for example, and etc. Like, how do you see that being produced or reproduced in those contexts?
Thank you. That's, I again, I feel like that's how much time do we have? And, the first thing I would say is that I really like this idea of building a discursive infrastructure for, for talking about gender talents, and in a way that the idea of gender as fluid, as a as a liquid rather than a binary, or gender as a spectrum, as light rather than bodies. David Cameron talked about himself as an energy being. These are all sort of like creative lines of flight out of something like the kind of social emergency of birth, right? To which was just alluded to, in which the current binaristic infrastructure has to be imposed, and those moments, those sort of like biopolitical moments, like birth or using a restroom or obtaining a passport, or all those interactions with sort of the infrastructure, right? I think are really important to certainly to queer theory and to trans theory, and at the same time, I think that it's not surprising to me that the millennials feel differently about their gender, in part because I think as a non-millennial, premillennial, it's so tricky. We have premillennial tension. We also felt differently, and the generation before us felt differently. To issue a generalization here, like no one fits the gender binary. It's sort of like, and just to look around this particular museum, because we're thinking about these questions in a place where just moments earlier, the choreographer Neva Costa was sort of populating the ground floor with a kind of discotopia of moving bodies that were drawing upon the social dances of Black, queer, and gendered non-normative spaces. That's the African diaspora. It's not elsewhere. It's actually like in the building. But the building doesn't really, like the white cube or whatever space that we're in, sort of, it doesn't always, well, it resonates in it, but then when it doesn't leave, it's hard to find a trace, like the museum space doesn't know always how to put it, that the kind of gender talents of a kind of Black performance and the sort of transformations of the body that come through a kind of performative embodiment gives something to spaces, gives something to infrastructure like this, and it's great to have the institution give back to that creativity in conversations like this.
Maybe one last question for everybody regarding this topic is, one of the things that I'm often confronted with is how space predetermines those norms. Like, so for instance, here we're reproducing very much a question of, there is a binary here. There is a binary of power, of hegemony, who's here, you're there, who's speaking, they're listening, and so on. And how can we disrupt, and all of you in your work have been opening up space in one way or another, kind of like changing imagination around these topics. But what do you think of potential structures of disruption that could be potentially more permanent, if you will, or transformative in different levels when it comes to thinking about gender, especially now when there is such a kind of emergence or a nascent emergence of discourses around gender identity in the mainstream media, the emergence of figures like Laverne Cox and people like that have, are out there and we are kind of paying attention to and seeing. Is that the strategy, or are there more kind of piercing, revolutionary strategies to think of? I'm not sure.
The first.
So how do we, let's say, break up the binary that exists in this room? And theoretically, if we were able to do that, then a harmonic of whatever we do to break up the binary here would work in any other binary situation. Tara, you want to grab your chair? Follow me, mirror me.
Okay.
No, mirror me. There you go. There, you've broken the binary. It's as simple as that. It is as simple as that, pointing out that there's a third. And once you've got a third, the binary, which is false, explodes and becomes a dialectic. Dialectic is a space that includes lots of binaries, men, women, male, female, boys, girls, cisgender, transgender, butch, femme. There's lots, and Tara and me, whatever the fuck we are. And it's the matter of pointing it out and holding your ground in this center space, and that's, I think, what's going to do it.
My students have a lot of questions, and I think you're right. I hold my ground and I stand in my place, and those are like that's the space I work in, and that's where the transformation will happen. Like it follows us, so we just have to commit to the work and do the work, and then sometimes we don't have an answer. So if I'm working, and the space change, can I explain on this? So depending on where I'm teaching, if I'm working with young immigrants who are learning English for the first time, and they say, he thinks you're a boy, I think you're a girl. And I said, well, what if neither of you are wrong? And they're like, that's confusing. I'm like, because it's supposed to be. Yeah, we don't have the answers. So I like, and then when you teach at a college level, they can ask other kinds of questions, and sometimes inappropriate. And then you say, oh, that question, super inappropriate. This is how do you want to phrase it? So I feel like the way you're saying it, yeah, you just take up space, you be who you are in that space, you recognize your power and privilege. For example, I have elective surgery, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I chose to have surgery. I had access to surgery, and it's very different to go into surgery with your own decision. It's your decision. And the healing process is very different than somebody who's their body's interfered with medically, they have no choice, it's very different. To me, I feel like being able to say that out loud is also something like very important to say like, I chose this. Not a lot of people look like me chose this. And then I could afford to choose this. And then like, what does it mean if I can afford to choose? I got rear-ended by a traffic cop. That's what paid for this. New York. But still, I think you're right. Hold your ground, be who you are, try to figure out how to put yourself in that situation, recognize your power, and try to figure out how to translate it. And then you and I are performers, so then we can try to wear it in different ways that we feel comfortable. It's like, that doesn't intimidate me. And oftentimes there is an anxiety where you are being stared at. And you're like, okay, now I'm being stared at, what am I going to do with it?
Yep. And the simple statement, I am not a man. I'm not. Not a man. And I am not a woman. Not. And that kind of paradoxical statement and holding one's ground. Well, wait a minute, then what are you? I'm not man, not woman. No, but you have to say what you are. I am not man, not woman. That's all you really need to say.
Do you have anything
to that? Right to self-determination. People choose surgery, or they have surgery imposed upon them.
Yes.
So people think that trans and intersex is the same thing. This is the difference. People who are trans, when they can afford it and when they want it, can choose surgery. People who are intersex have surgery forced upon them and are made into medical patients for the rest of their lives against their will. So that's important. It's important for me to perform gender in a way that I exaggerate and make a joke of being male-looking. Being male-looking in this culture allows me to be, I'm a male white doctor. Okay? Now, how better could I have done than that? So I get to go all kinds of places where I can disrupt people's ideas about when I say, like you just said, I am not a man. And most of the men in the audiences are tending to think, I'd like to be that much of a man. Okay? So I use this exaggeration to make this point over and over and over again. And because of the value of the internet and video, I will be saying this for years and years after my death. So these things are incredibly important, to do the things that allow us to be the secret agents that sneak in and force people to have to challenge their own thinking. So I look out into the audience and I see that there are lots of people out there who do things that perform gender in such a way that they choose to appear female, they choose to appear male. And that is an imposition upon you. That is something that society forces upon you. That is something that you are made to do as a result of what's expected of you in your gender role and in your gender identity, gender role. So you have to make sense of how much of that do I want to adhere to, and how much of that do I want to give away, and how much of that do I want to be tyrannized by, and what happens to me as a result of choosing to look male, what happens to me as a result of choosing to look female, what do I lose, what do I gain? These are more important questions than most people ever consider, but boy, I've considered them a lot over the years.
Just on the question that Carlos asked about what the widespread media representations and visibility does to these questions, that's interesting. This idea that televisual visibility then can kind of have this sort of perpetuity. It allows me to say kind of two things about sort of my own sort of presence on this panel. One was, when I was invited to participate, I did have some questions about, taking the speaker's benefit on a panel, which there are many more people qualified to speak to it, including some in the audience today. And then I thought, well, there's also there also is this responsibility to sort of model someone who can be kind of educated about issues and receptive to the kinds of gender performatives that you were just performing, right, in terms of Tara, and that he was just doing. And the other thing I was thinking was how, in some ways, I am a very gender untalented person, right? Because I sort of conform to the gender that I was assigned pretty unproblematically, but thinking of it as gender untalented rather than some other way actually gives me access to something I've always sort of thought about, is sort of how I respond to other bodies who are gender talented, right? And how, although it is very much about disrupting the binary, there's a long-winded way of saying disrupting the binary is a collaborative and a collective project, and that this event here is sort of, no disrespect to Diane Sawyer, but the kind of un-Bruce Jenner interview, right? Because it's very important to have those moments of visibility and the long individual, but all the, I hope we get to see some of the videos and the gender talents, but also, what they kind of really underscore is the collective and collaborative nature of doing that kind of long-term, discursive infrastructural change, which is always, not always, but very often going to be very local, right? It's going to be in different languages. It's going to address not only different gender binaries, but different racial and gendered and class and caste and national hierarchies, and so it has to be collective in some ways, right? And there has to be both a kind of a reception as well as a performance of gender talent, I guess. I think about the iconicity of Juliana Huxtable at this current biennial, and both how wonderful and amazing it is that a transgender artist is sort of the icon of the biennial, or triennial, sorry. That's a trialectic, I guess, a trialectic, right? And also the work that we as artists and activists and intellectuals and scholars have to do to kind of sustain those artists, right? So that they're not just the image of, but actually are able to develop and grow and are supported, and I think that's part of what this project is about, right? I think towards the end we're talking about art,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Well, thank you. Maybe we move on to the next topic. So this is a video that is part of the portraits in Guatemala, and Galilea, who's here, is going to be, Galilea and Marcela are going to be guiding myself and the crew I was working with through Guatemala City, Zona Uno, which is the center of town, which is also a place where they engage in sex work historically. So this is a kind of tour through this area.
Bueno, pues ahorita estamos saliendo de la zona 5 de Guatemala y vamos a entrevistar a algunas compañeras trans trabajadoras sexuales del centro histórico de la zona 1 de Guatemala. No tenemos opciones de ejercer el trabajo sexual en lugares cerrados y más que la única opción es pararnos en una esquina y vamos a ver a diferentes compañeras trans que ejercen el trabajo sexual por necesidad porque es el único medio de subsistencia para poder sobrevivir aquí en Guatemala. El contexto sexual en Guatemala es como en cualquier país, creo, es bastante peligroso y pues lo hacemos no porque seamos valientes, sino porque la necesidad nos orilla a ejercer el trabajo sexual. En este momento pues estamos aquí con las compañeras del equipo de trabajo de Refutrans y pues que también por la necesidad que existe en nosotras tenemos que también ejercer el trabajo sexual. Estamos justamente ahorita en la esquina de la Tercera Avenida y 16 calle de la zona 1 de Guatemala.
A pesar de tener una profesión, me he visto en la necesidad a veces de ejercer el comercio sexual porque, como comento, en lo económico la situación guatemalteca está pésima, entonces hay necesidad de adaptar otro ámbito laboral en este sentido.
Soy estilista, pero no tengo trabajo fijo, solo a esto me dedico con mi mamá y ¿cómo se llama? Alquilamos en la casa tenemos que sacar el dinero para la comida y para pagar el alquiler del apartamento.
Hay veces que se trabaja y hay veces que no se trabaja, ¿verdad? Y hay veces que tenemos para comer y a veces tenemos que aguantarnos, ¿verdad? Aguantar el frío hasta conseguir algo para la comida, ¿verdad?
En este momento vamos a pasar sobre la 15 calle de la zona 1 para entrevistar a algunas chicas que se dedican al trabajo del contorno sexual. En momentos, así como es muy tranquila, también es muy violenta. Esto depende de clientes, a veces riñas entre ellas mismas, dependiendo por drogas o alcohol. Pero sí, es muy violenta ya que muchas no saben, desconocen a qué carro se van a subir o con qué personas se van a subir. He sido amiga, confidente de muchos hombres, los cuales a veces recurren a muchas de nosotras para poderse desahogar de problemas familiares, problemas laborales. Entonces, esa es una de las experiencias bonitas de las que pasa uno. Ahora, por el otro lado, hay también problemática ya que he sido violentada, por lo menos yo, físicamente, ya que me han pegado, me han asaltado, hasta en 3 ocasiones que fui violada sexualmente y no pude decir nada porque estaba arriesgando mi vida. Cuando recurrimos al personal policíaco, por X o Y razón de algún problema callejero, siempre llevamos nosotras las de perder, porque siempre se le va a dar la credibilidad al acusante o al victimario y de víctimas pasamos a ser las culpables, las victimarias.
Trabajé 5 años en un restaurante y por lo mismo me discriminaron y tuve que acudir al trabajo sexual.
¿Por qué ella no pudo seguir trabajando en el restaurante?
Porque lo discriminan a uno y donde lo ven a uno tratan la manera de sacarlo, pues, porque no están metidos en darle a una persona así trabajo.
¿Cómo era su experiencia ahí en su trabajo?
Ajá, pues ahí lo explotan a uno, tratan la manera de como ahogarlo para salir uno mismo y discriminarlo, tratarlo mal a uno.
con amenazas de muerte, de ponerlo a uno a ejercer más trabajo.
¿Y nos puede contar cómo es su vida aquí en el trabajo sexual? ¿Es bonito? ¿Es feo?
No, es duro pues porque tiene que venir diariamente a presentarse varias cosas, peligro, violencia, amenazas también y muchas cosas que suceden acá en la calle. En mi familia me aceptan, en el área que vivo también, en parte de comunidades social casi no mucho, pues porque como le decía, por medio de educación, de salud, hay muchas cosas que lo discriminan a uno. Tiene apoyo uno de familia, pero apoyo socialmente y políticamente acá en Guatemala no hay pues una aceptación como debería de ser, una identidad de género.
Aquí vamos a dirigirnos a la 15 calle, estamos en la 15 calle y segunda avenida y vamos sobre la 15 calle a la tercera avenida. Siempre vamos a hablar del contexto de la zona 1 de Guatemala, donde más se concentra el trabajo sexual en Guatemala, por ser el centro histórico y ser una de las zonas más concurridas de la ciudad.
Yo siento que aquí hay así como que muchas personas que tienen así como que envidia o tienen, ¿cómo te dijera? Porque aquí es nueva, porque le está quitando clientes o porque trabaja más y me está quitando mis clientes o porque cobra menos. Sí, eso es lo que yo siento que también.
O tal vez porque cobra más o porque es más bonita o más joven, entonces viene otra y viene y le empieza como a pedirle dinero o a tratarla o a golpearla. Yo he visto muchas veces cómo han golpeado a otras, cómo las han quitado las pelucas, sus ropas, sus zapatos, todo.
Sí, y dejemos eso, que se supone que si uno está aquí en la calle es porque en verdad uno necesita el dinero. Porque, bueno, amiga, así como digo, uno no es moneda de oro para caerle bien a todas, ¿no crees? Entonces, yo creo que si todas estamos acá, o sea que yo siento que todas nos tenemos que apoyar. Hay hombres como dicen, va, que te ofrecen más dinero para que lo hagas sin condón y así como que uno está muy necesitado de dinero tal vez y no queda de otra que hacer.
Pero no tenemos ningún plan para protegernos, ¿verdad? Porque estamos vulnerables de estar aquí en la calle, que puede pasar cualquier cosa, nos golpea cualquier cosa, pero hasta ahorita no nos ha pasado así algo tan grave, de que sí nos han asaltado, pero no así tan bruscamente. No tenemos un plan tampoco, ¿verdad? Porque no podemos ponernos en contra de hombres fuertes o que tienen armas, entonces porque nosotros incluso no andamos ni armadas.
Y las cosas buenas es así como que salís adelante, tú sola te sabes esperar, sola salís adelante y aparte de eso conocer nuevas amistades. Yo siento que entre ellas también se pueden apoyar mutuamente.
Lo que es obtener el dinero más fácil y más rápido, ¿va? No hay que esperar una semana o 15 días para tenerlo. Y uno tiene su propio empleo, se puede decir, uno es dueño de su tiempo.
Mi proceso de transgénera ha sido desde que yo tengo uso de razón, porque me criaron como niña, porque yo vivía con ellos, con mis padres, y cuando me sacaban, prácticamente no me sacaban a la calle porque decían, ay no, es una niña. Se sentían mal, mi padre, mi madre se sentía re mal por ver una niña, pero no era niña, era un varón, decía. Era algo muy frustrante para mí, muy molesto, muy duro. Me cortaban el pelo a la fuerza, yo salía corriendo para que no me cortaran el pelo. Fui creciendo como mujer. Fue duro, pero nunca dejé que me pisotearan. Lo bonito y lo positivo que tengo ahora es de que ahorita mis padres que me han hecho daño, ahora los he encontrado, 20 años después los he encontrado, solos, sin hijos, y ahora yo estoy con ellos y yo los mantengo y están bien conmigo. He llegado a esta edad, como otras compañeras ya no están. Las otras compañeras, amigas de mi época ya no existen. Existen unas 4 o 5 y la única que he quedado aquí en la calle soy yo. Mis mejores recuerdos es haber encontrado un hombre que ha hecho aprecio de mí a la fecha. Tengo 27 años con él y ese es el único recuerdo bonito que tengo, porque todavía está conmigo y sigue luchando conmigo y estamos juntos en las buenas y en las malas.
Tuve problemas en mi casa con mi familia por el hecho de haber dicho que era gay, al principio que era gay. Cuando me volví trans fue peor, le hice bajar el yello, entonces decidí, para no causar ningún problema, entonces en mi casa decidí venirme para acá. Me ofrecieron la oportunidad de trabajo, o sea, no exactamente en la calle, pero con el tiempo en el lugar donde trabajaba, ya no querían. Yo trabajaba en un centro comercial y entonces pusieron una regla de que no querían, porque en los capítulos un tiempo estuvo eso, que no querían trans. Nos mandaron a cortar el pelo, a ponernos uniformes de hombre y eso hasta, de hecho, violenta nuestros derechos porque no tienen ningún derecho a querer cambiar nuestra manera de ser, ¿va? Entonces decidí mejor al trabajo sexual.
Porque no tuviste otra
Porque
opción.
no tuve otra opción, obviamente, porque imagínate iba a llegar de trans a otro lugar y que le hicieran lo mismo. No, usted no cortes el pelo porque usted es hombre. Entonces, como que eso no. Entonces, a eso nos orillan, a que trabajemos sexo, a que corramos riesgos aquí. Todo, porque aquí pasa de todo.
So unfortunately, Nelly is no longer with us. She passed away last year out of many complications with life, I guess. But what I wanted to ask you all, and perhaps Camilo, si le puedes traducir a Galilea, about this question of kind of LGBT politics, like mainstream LGBT politics, and the internationalization or the kind of mainstreaming of agendas, and the ways in which these agendas may or may not work in relationship to the intersections of class and race and the different kind of political and social conditions that affect different communities, and recognizing that the experience of middle-class Americans or specific American communities could be very radically different from the experience of Galilea and her community and her friends in Guatemala engaging in sex work, or the experience of Indian trans women, like we will see in a different video later. But what about this kind of mainstreaming of a political discourse and agenda that, in my opinion, is also one that is very much structured along the lines of a gender binary and a kind of mainstreaming of ideas and ideals of what political strategy is. How does that work? How can we pierce through sort of like the holes that points to in terms of the recognition of difference and etc. I don't know, perhaps you want to start that?
Sure. I guess I need to begin by saying that this particular portrait is difficult for me to watch for a number of reasons. Not least of all that I feel implicated in it as a kind of ride along John. Because the form of the video really kind of takes you into these women's working place, and your it includes one getting into a car, and it's part of there are sort of elements of a certain kind of genre of sort of documentary filmmaking that implicates me as a viewer, right? In wanting to both kind of interrogate my own desire to know, actually, and also to take up time. When one of the people, one of the women says, that actually not in this video. Well, someone mentions men who pay extra for condomless sex, and then in another video, there's a discussion of what would motivate you to do that, and it's like, well, if you need the money, if you need the pesos to get a bed that night, and then you feel implicated in the time you're taking, from the work that needs to happen for that, and what, so we're implicated, in acts of representation, certainly, and any kind of work I know little about Guatemala, but more about the kinds of global solidarity work, and I've written a little bit about the global solidarity work that's been done in relationship to Uganda around LGBT issues, and in Kenya and in Zimbabwe and in Africa, right? And it's a very delicate question of whether or not the kind of NGO or the human rights intervention around the global solidarity that we feel it can have the impact that we would like, but also whether it can have unintended consequences for the people we're intending to assist, right? By making them more visible to transphobic and homophobic and violent forces in their society that we're not always able as visitors in those spaces to protect them against, right? So I think a lot about the sort of that problem, and then in the realm of sort of just to kind of offer another kind of text alongside this one to think about, the artist Ruth Sang. I don't know if people know the film Wildness, but there's also a film he did called For How We Perceived a Life, in which he took and sort of reperformed some of the footage from the Paris is Burning archive. And I don't know if people also know that film, a very kind of important film in well, actually in the formation of queer theory. I feel like every queer theorist worth their salt wrote an essay about Paris is Burning back in the day, right? And I think what we did with that film was really wonderful to kind of take the kind of ethnographic structure of the interview, right? And to go into the archive and see, Jenny Livingston as the interviewer, sort of the questions she was asking, and then to reperform them, actually. And there was a kind of back and forth, the binary there being the documentary filmmaker and her subject, and then in that piece, For How We Perceived a Life, those poses, right? The pose behind the camera and the pose in front of the camera get thrown into a kind of twirl, I suppose. So those are some thoughts I think about.
Do you have any thoughts?
Come back to me. I want to hear. I don't want to go first all the time.
I'll keep my comments short. I think it would be, I've worked primarily in a domestic situation, and I can see similarities coming out of the conversations that are being had from work with the Sylvia Rivera Law Project or working with Green Chimneys, Gramercy foster care system. And a lot of it stemming in labor and survival, and homelessness and immigration and incarceration, and sort of the things that travel around sex work and survival in this country, being like domestic violence shelters, drug treatment facilities, foster care, and that those facilities themselves are binary. And so what one would confront when and if they tried to get support and go through the proper channels. For example, a trans woman who wants to go into a drug treatment facility because it had been authorized, by the courts or whatever, she would have to shave her head. And so there's this question for me. So those kinds of questions come up, but I'm not sure how appropriate it is to place that on top of a global politic. But I can see these things about immigration, labor, race, and class. Obviously, there's things within our country that there's a similar narrative, but I think I have to be very careful. And then when you're talking about documentary filmmaking, and Carlos's project, like the way that this is structured as portraits and not a narrative, I think is helpful, and that there are contradictions within it, I think is helpful. I think we'll talk more about self-representation and giving people cameras in the next section, but I think that's a nice lead-in, but this is, so that's where I'll leave it, domestic.
So, what I notice in this and what I notice a lot is that everyone who's represented in this piece is born male and choosing to represent themselves as female, and they're all in a place where, because of that choice, because that is their true identity and they're expressing that identity, that they are more discriminated against, that they are forced to be more poor, that they have fewer rights, that their access to resources are significantly reduced. That's a consistent issue for me, that people who present as female get less and have a much harder life as a result of that presentation. They have access to fewer privileges. In the trans community, when I see middle-class people or upper-class people who are trans, I see so many people who choose to move from male to female who, because of biology, struggle more with passing as female. And so often I see people who were born female and choose to, or are identifying themselves as male, they pass. They pass so much more easily, and they have so much more access to privilege, and they seem to have an easier time in so many ways. And again, it's because the male identification, the male presentation, it's a consistent problem with the binary, that people who choose to present as male or people who identify as male just seem to have an easier time of getting access to resources and privilege. And here it is again, and it's not just the United States. Don't know what to do about that.
This is something I've been trying to figure out myself. I've been trying to contextualize the fact that trans women of color who are sex workers are the most at-risk population within the trans world. And it comes back, we're looking at Guatemala, and am I right that the Catholic Church is a big influence there? And most of Central and South America? Okay, that means that the gender binary is held in place in part by religious moralism. Nothing else. Pope Benedict condemned postmodern gender theory. Even marvelous Pope Francis, I love the guy, has come out and compared trans theory to nuclear warfare because it is destroying the natural order of men and women. I can't wait till it does. But what does that do then? What we've got piled up on trans women of color who are sex workers is a perfect storm of institutionalized sex negativity. Oh no, sex is bad, moralistic gender, racism, and misogyny. You've got a perfect storm of intersecting oppressions ending up on trans women of color who are sex workers. Now, people, there's no real voice, there's no real activism that gets mainstream coverage for sex positivity, for gender anarchy, even the transgender tipping point that's been reached. And the famous people who are transgender are binary compliant. They are trans women. They are trans men. We don't see people who are neither. So as long as you can comply with this moralistic gender, with this sex negativity, oh no, we mustn't show titty or penises, the activism itself is stymied. Okay. So what happens is the politics of respectability rises above all of those intersecting oppressions. Well, look, this is fine. Look, we have Laverne Cox. She's a woman of color. She's a star, and she's beautiful, and I love her. I know her. I love her. I admire her. She's smart. She has great stuff to say. And she's respectable. And once you reach a point of respectability, we leave behind people who are outspokenly sex positive, outspokenly gender anarchists.
Galilea, ¿tú quisieras agregar algo en esta conversación? No sé si Camilo te ha estado... No? Thank you. I guess in the interest of time, we'll need to move on to the next segment. We'll be watching a much shorter clip from India, and I'll talk about it in a second.
My name is Kalki Subramaniam. I run an organization called Sahodri Foundation in Tamil Nadu, which is for the social, political, economic, and legal empowerment and rights of the transsexual and transgender, intersex, hijra people of our country. Besides that, I'm an actress, and I recently got into business as well because I wanted to be a successful businesswoman, which is one of my dreams in life. For me, being an activist is something very close to my heart. It's my soul work, I think. Sahodri Foundation was started with the intention of actually bringing a change in the society. So we started as a small organization, and till today we are small, but we are a very powerful organization. Being a sexual minority in India, the transgender community has been facing severe discrimination in all levels of our life, right from our childhood, right from family unacceptance and discriminations in schools and colleges and stigma in the workplace, and then many of them being left out by their parents, lack of education. All these things have led the community on the roads as beggars and sex workers. The biggest understanding and ignorance comes from the mainstream media. For example, the print media, television, and the films, the regional vernacular films. Most of them have been portraying transgender people as only as sex workers or sexual perverts, as people with no intellect. They have been treating us inhumanly, especially the films have been treating us inhumanly. ஸோ அதனால் தகவல் பரிமாற்றம் அப்படிங்கிறது ரொம்ப மிகப்பெரிய முறையில் சுலபமாக இருக்குது. ஸோ இந்த எல்லா விஷயங்களையும் யூஸ் பண்ணிவிட்டு we can take advantage of all of these things. Like the massive growth of technology can be used in such a powerful way that we can bring a change to our community, the marginalized transgender community. So how is it possible? What can we do about it? What is the first few steps that we can take? This training program, I've been teaching them about what is community journalism or citizen journalism, and especially I focused on short documentary filmmaking. I just give them a small handy cam through which I actually teach them the different shots and angles and how to make a short documentary film of their own. It could be a story about their life. It could be a story about an issue that another transgender person faces. It could be a story about family unacceptance or family acceptance. With the current technology, with the current tools and techniques available, with the explosion of the mobile technology and the internet technology and the massive growth of social media, these revolutionary things have actually been good to us.
எங்களோட வேலைகள் என்னன்னு பார்த்தீங்கன்னா, இப்போ நான் ஒரு தனிப்பட்ட முறையில் தான் சகோதரி ஃபவுண்டேஷனில் ஒர்க் பண்ணிகிட்டு இருந்தேன். முதல்ல நான் கேமரா ஹேண்டில் பண்ணுறது கற்றுக்கிட்டேன். அப்புறம் நானும் ஒரு சின்ன குறும்படம் எடுத்தேன். அப்புறம் என் ஃபேமிலி, என்னோட ஹஸ்பண்டு, எங்கள் அம்மா வச்சு ஒரு காலேஜில் என்னோட டாக்குமெண்ட்ரி ஒருத்தவங்க பண்ணாங்க. இப்படி போயிட்டுருக்கிற பட்சத்தில் அப்புறம் கல்கி சொன்னாங்க, உனக்கு நிறைய டேலண்ட் இருக்குது, நீ ஏன் அதை அப்படியே இது பண்ணிகிட்ருக்க, நான் பார்த்த விஷயத்தில் வேறு நீ கேமரா ஹேண்டில் பண்ணுறலாம், உங்ககிட்ட கொஞ்சம் திறமை இருக்குது, இன்னும் நீ கொஞ்சம் கற்றுக்கணும், நீ ஒன்றுமே ட்ரைனிங் கொடுக்காமே நீ இவ்வளோ கற்றுக்கிட்டு இருக்கும்போது இன்னும் நீ ட்ரைனிங்லாம் இது பண்ணாக்கா நல்லா ஒரு பெண் காலத்தில் நல்லா வரலாம், நீ ஒரு 10 பேருக்கு சொல்லிக் கொடுக்கலாம். அது எக்ஸாம்பிள் நான் இன்றைக்கி 2 days ஆறுவேலில் நான் 14 பேருக்கு நான் ட்ரைனிங் கொடுக்க போகிறேன். அதில் நீ கொஞ்சம் உனக்கு தெரிஞ்சல நீ கொஞ்சம் அவங்களுக்கு ட்ரைனிங் கொடுத்தீங்கன்னாக்கா அதுலேயும் நீ இன்னும் நீ தெரியாத விஷயங்கள்லாம் கற்றுக்கலாம், 4 பேருக்கு நீ கற்றுக் கொடுத்த மாதிரியும் இருக்கும் அப்படின்னு அவங்க சொன்னாங்க. அதனால் நான் இன்றைக்கி
நான் எடுத்த மூவி பேர் மை மதர். எங்களை முதல்ல வீட்டை விட்டு தொடுத்த ஒன்று எங்களுக்கு ஒரு தாய் பாசம் தான் கிடைக்குது. எனக்கு எங்கள் அம்மா தானே என்னை முதல்ல எடுத்துக்கினாங்க. எங்கள் அம்மா பற்றி நான் எடுக்கணும்னு ஆசைப்படும் போது ஒருத்தரை பற்றி எடுத்தால் நல்லா இருக்காது, அவங்கவுங்க ஸ்டோரி டிஃப்ரெண்ட்டாக இருக்கும்போது 3 பேரோட ஸ்டோரி எடுத்தேன். இதை வந்து சினிமா தேட்டரில் போட்டு எங்களால் லைவ் பண்ண முடியலன்னா எனக்கு தெரிஞ்ச ஃப்ரெண்ட்ஸுக்கிட்ட சொல்லுவேன். யூடியூப்பில் வந்து அதை பற்றி ஷேர் பண்ணுவாங்க. அதில் அவங்க அடிக்கிற கமெண்ட்டில் வந்து எனக்கு ஒரு சந்தோஷம் கிடைக்கும். அது போதும் எனக்கு.
நம்ம இந்த மாதிரிலாம் ஒரு நல்ல எங்கள் கம்யூனிட்டியில் வந்து இப்போ சேர்ந்தாக்கா அதுவும் என்ஜிஓ மூலயமா சில என்ஜிஓ மூலயமா வந்து எங்களை வச்சு சாப்பிட்றவங்களும் இருக்கிறாங்க. ஆனால் அதெல்லாம் இல்லாமல் இந்த மாதிரி ஒரு சின்ன சின்ன வந்து திறமையை வளர்த்துக்கிட்டு கம்ப்யூட்டர் படிக்கணும் கம்ப்யூட்டர், அப்புறம் வந்து படிக்காதவங்களுக்கு படிப்பு, அப்புறம் வந்து என்ன அவங்களுக்குள்ள என்ன திறமை இருக்கோ அதை வந்து வெளிப்படுத்துறதுக்கு இதுக்கு ஒரு சான்ஸாக இருக்குது எங்கள் கம்யூனிட்டிக்கு. நம்ம இப்படி பிறந்தோம் வளர்ந்தோம் இல்லாமல் எதனா ஒன்று சாதிக்கணும். நான் தான் ஏதோ ஒரு சமுதாயத்தில் வந்து ஒரு ஏதோ கேலி கிண்டல் மாதிரி பிறந்துட்டேன். அதனால் நம்ம அது மாதிரியே போயிடக்கூடாது. நம்மளும் வந்து சமுதாயத்தில் நல்லா நம்மள திருநங்கன்னா இவங்க நல்லவங்க நல்லா கேவலமாக பேசக்கூடாது. நான் பண்ணுறதை பார்த்து இன்னும் சில திருநங்கைகள் வந்து அதை முயற்சி எடுத்து பண்ணுவாங்க. அதுக்கு எக்ஸாம்ஸ்லாம் இன்றைக்கி நடக்கிற ஒரு ப்ரோக்ராம்னு சொல்லுங்கள்.
இந்த பக்கம் ஒரு பைக்கு, இந்த பக்கம் சைக்கிள் ஒரு பையன். இந்த பைக்கு பக்கத்தில் சௌந்தர்ய மாதிரியான கோத்தி நிற்குது. கடை கேட்குது, ஒயின் ஷாப் வாசலில் கடை கேட்குது. இவங்க என்னெல்லாம் டீஸ் பண்ணுறான்னு முழுமையாக ஒரு வார்த்தை கூட விடாமல் அவ்வளோ ஒரு ஆபாசமாக அவன் தொடர்ந்து கிடுறது எல்லாமே அப்படியே ஃபேஸ்புக்கில் போட்டிருக்காங்களே. அங்கே எங்கே ரைட்ஸ் வயலேஷன் அந்த பையனுக்காவது இஷ்யூ இருந்திருக்குமே. அவ்வளோ அசிங்கமாக மச்சான் அன்றைக்கி உள்ளே விட்டான் பற்றியா ஆட்டினம் பற்றியா அப்போ முதல்ல எப்படா அவனுக்கு உள்ளே பெருசாச்சு முதல்ல ஒன்றுமே இருக்காது. இப்படியான வார்த்தைகள் கடைசியில் அவன் தேவடியா பையன் அந்த பட்ட அந்த பையனை தேவடியா பையன் சொல்லிட்டு தட்டி விட்டுட்டு போட்டேன். அது வரைக்கும் அந்த வீடியோ முடியுது. அது ரீசெண்டாக நானும் போட்டிருந்தேன். அவ்வளோலாம் நம்மளை பற்றி யாரோ நல்லதான் பண்ணுறாங்க. எப்படி டீஸ் பண்ணுறாங்க பாரு பிச்சை எடுக்கிற போத்திங்களா அப்படின்ற மாதிரி. நம்ம அம்மா கிட்ட பேசுகிற அந்த வார்த்தைகளை எடிட் பண்ணுறோம். தெரியாமல் எடுத்துட்டா தப்பு அப்படின்றது தெரியாமல் எடுத்துட்டு பார்க்கலாம். அதை எடிட் பண்ணிக்கலாமே. அங்கே பேசவே முடியல, இல்லை அழுதுனே இருக்கிறாங்கன்னா ஒரு பாயிண்ட்டுமே வரல. நீ கிண்ணத்தில் எதையும் தின்றது மட்டும்தான் அங்கே தெரியுது. அவங்க 2 வார்த்தை சொல்கிறாங்க, அவ்வளோதான். ஆனந்தியமாக
இல்லை இதில் என்ன அப்படின்னா 3 பேரோட அம்மாவும் அக்செப்ட் பண்ணிக்கிறாங்க. ஸோ அவங்க வந்து எமோஷனலாக பிரேக் டவுன் ஆகி சில வார்த்தைகள் அவங்க சரியாக பேசலனாலும் எமோஷனலாக பிரேக் டவுன் ஆனாங்கன்னா அவங்களுடைய இன்செக்யூர் ஃபீலிங் தான். தான் பையன் வந்து இப்போ தான் பையன் மேலே நேசம் இருக்குது, பாசம் இருக்குது, இருந்தாலும் இந்த உலகம் வந்து அவனை சிதைச்சிருமோங்கிற அந்த பயம், சொந்தக்காரங்க ஏற்றுக்கலையே அப்படிங்கிற அந்த ஏக்கம், இந்த ஏமாற்றங்கள் கண்டிப்பாக ஆட் பண்ணியிருக்கலாம். என்ன அப்படின்னா இந்த டைம் எடுக்கும்போதெல்லாம் இவங்க நாங்கள் வந்து எந்த ட்ரைனிங் எதுவுமே கிடையாது, ஒர்க் ஷாப்ஸ் எதுவுமே கிடையாது, டிஸ்கஷன்ஸ் எதுவுமே கிடையாது, கேம்ப். எக்ஸாக்ட்லி. யா
அந்த ஹோப்னா எல்லாருமே நாங்கள் தைரியமாக வெளியே வந்திருக்கிறோம். அதனால் எங்களுக்கு எல்லாமே கிடச்சிருக்குது. அது தவிர வேறு எந்த ஹோப்பும் கிடையாது. யாரும் எங்களுக்கு ஹெல்ப் பண்ணலை. நாங்களே எங்கள் கையை ஊன்றி தான் நாங்கள் எழுந்திருக்கிறோம். எங்களுக்கு யாரும் பேக் போனாக கிடையாது. எல்லா திருநங்கைகளும் ஏதோ ஒரு வகையில் போராடி தான் ஏதாவது ஒரு சலுகைகளை பெற்றுக்கொண்டு இருக்கிறாங்க. அதனால எல்லா திருநங்கைகளும் முன்னாடி வந்தால் இன்னும் ஜென்ரல் கம்யூனிட்டி மாதிரி எல்லா சலுகைகளும் எங்களால் வாங்க முடியுன்றது தான் எங்களோட ஹோப்.
As a marginalized community, as a marginalized person myself, I'm happy that I have my own voice, and I want my community also to have their own voice, and the current technology facilitates that, and that makes me happy and that makes me hopeful.
I wanted to ask just a note. We're running short on time and we don't want to keep you from the sun longer, so we're going to cut the last chapter. So I'm going to pose some questions about this, and then we can have a conversation for the last 20 minutes with you guys if you have any questions. I wanted to bring up this question of the voice and of self-representation for trans and intersex issues, the question of telling your own stories, the question of representing yourself, and how that is important or not for you, especially in light of what you were just mentioning, Kate, that this kind of visibility of trans people, but under the rubric of respectability as well. Like, so whose stories are told, who has the right to tell their own story? Can you address this from your perspective?
Tara, I think you're in the spotlight on this question, self-expression.
Well, actually, I remember reading your book, and being like, oh my gosh, she keeps interrupting herself. Oh, they just did this thing where they put somebody else's writing in the middle of the narrative. Oh, this is a manifesto. Oh, this is autobiographical. So I'm reading Gender Outlaw looking for. So I would say that I look to alternative structures and interruptions of narrative with people using their own experience, right? So I love this project, and I can see it work. Like, I love the project. I love the idea of media literacy and working with people to teach them technology in order for people to be able to articulate what they want to say. And I liked there wasn't language, there wasn't people talking about this in the same way in the early 90s. I was hungry for it. So I actually think you do this, but I will speak to how it translates into, and I see Carlos is doing this too, because it's not, they're portraits together, and portraits together that also interrupt one another, or conflict with one another, or complement one another, right? So, but that said, so I will look at, I was talking to Tiger earlier and asked them if they were familiar with Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who I sometimes perform as. He was an early alienist, and he wrote Psychopathia Sexualis. It is a taxonomy of sexual aberrations. We are all probably represented in this book. It's really juicy reading. However, it wasn't written by the case studies themselves. The case studies are written about them. And so I was looking through this, and I was actually finding signs of resistance. And my favorite, if you don't mind, if I can read from this. Where are you? Okay. Case 133. She's my favorite. Psychosexual metamorphosis. And again, this is written by Richard von Krafft-Ebing. He always spoke of himself in the third person and called himself the Countess V, the dearest friend of the Empress Eugenie, asked for perfumes, corsets, etc. He took the other men of the ward for girls, right? So this case study is institutionalized because she lives as female in the turn of the century, so they institutionalize her. And this is how she responds to this. So she spends the greatest part of the day in bed, acted like an invalid lady of position, affectedly and modestly, and asked for bonbons and the like. Her hair was done up in a knot as well as it allowed, and her beard was pulled out. Breasts were made of rolls of bread. So I love her resistance within this institutionalization. And so I think it's really important that we look, like this is an example of looking back at the archive and critiquing the archive where we are not represented. And so I'll perform as Richard von Krafft-Ebing, or I'll perform as Case 133 and eat bonbons and demand corsets, etc. So I'm able to do that within my artistic practice. But that's, again, I don't feel like I'm giving voice to, and I think that's a very important thing. I feel like I'm digging through the archive to find representations that maybe feel more comfortable or similar to my lived experience. And even if it's written in this weird narrative, I'm like, oh, we would be friends, she and I. So I think that part's very important, that and Tiger, I think you spoke to this. It's about self-representation and what did you call it? Self-determination. And that's not just with how we wear our bodies, but it's also like with how we construct our stories using media. And so I really like that there is an element of teaching the technology in order for people to tell their own stories using the technology instead of saying, I gave people a voice because I gave them a camera. You gave them a camera. So I like that. I like this as an example of how to what you were talking about, collective work, collaborative work, and so sharing resources and stories, but stories that come from the people themselves.
Can I just say something on this, just to pick up on this question of sort of media literacy, because there's sort of like, it's like nested dolls in this particular excerpt, but it's the Gender Challenge Project, and then it's also the project inside, which is called, what's the name of the project?
The Citizen Journalism?
Yeah, I'll call it the Citizen Journalism Project. And within that, there's like a moment that I want to kind of pull out there, which the women are watching and critiquing the film, and they're kind of debating the kind of ethics of a particular, but it's, I think, and here's like the kind of note of caution, I think it's also underlying all our aspirations towards voice, right, and self-expression. We're always grappling with the reality that this apparatus of media literacy is the apparatus of capture, right? It is the apparatus of surveillance, and it's also the apparatus of violence, right? They're looking at imagery of someone being bashed, right? And they're debating the ethics of watching something that the person who's being bashed did not consent to, right? And I think we confront this question again, not only in India, but like right here in New York City with the person who filmed Eric Garner, in Baltimore. All acts of citizen journalism today are facing a really complex And I don't have the answers to, right? I think it has to be a kind of a collective question, right? As to sort of, as we are expressing ourselves and our efforts to go outside the gender binary and live differently and feel differently, other people are using those same technologies to express themselves right, in ways that are harassing and bullying and policing. And that's real, right? I mean, the technologies of self-expression are politically untrustworthy, you know? They're distributed, right? Like, and so we can't not use them. We have to be literate and trained within them, but we also have to be kind of aware that their power is the power of voice, the power of self-expression, particularly at a political moment, I think globally, where everyone's, like the one imperative of like neoliberal capitalism is express yourself, right? But there's no power over your own life, right? Mm-hmm. Like people feel really, really powerless today, right? And so I think a lot of the violence that the outlier faces, right? Those who are the gender anarchists, the nonconformists, the disrespectable, right? It's a kind of anomic violence directed out of feelings of powerlessness that then get that certain people become the scapegoats for, right? So I just want to pick up that moment because I think it's a really important, intense moment in the film when they're thinking critically about like, not just the camera, but sort of like who else has the camera and how to think about the circulation of images.
So intersex people have been presented initially as a medical anomaly and a mistake of nature. And there was a famous psychologist named John Money who worked at Johns Hopkins Hospital, who worked with a bunch of doctors who decided that this new technology of plastic surgery could be applied to the genitals of people who had different genitals to make them look like females or make them look like males. And this was the first exposure I had to anything that could explain to me why what had happened to me throughout my childhood happened to me. And I made it my business to become an intern of John Money's and to study with him at his place at Johns Hopkins. One of the conditions of my internship, seriously, was that I'd be willing to go on television with him and admit to the fact that I was a hermaphrodite. And I did that. And that's how I would become the first out intersex person in media. And from then on, I became the go-to person for anything having to do with media that touched upon intersex or hermaphroditism in any way. So I made it my business to start collecting other people who were intersexed and to inspire them to be willing to come out publicly. And many people who are now seen as leaders of that movement, of that community, were people who I pushed out of their closets, and I purposely stood out of the way of taking many, many opportunities to promote myself, to put them forward, because I wanted more people, I wanted more faces to be seen as intersex people. And now there are international organizations of support. There are millions of people who are out as intersex around the world. Lots and lots and lots of them, very young people, teenagers, who are willing to go on the internet, and you can see them on something called Interact. You can see them on something called the Interface Project. You can see them on television. You can see them as characters in television shows. Lots and lots of faces of people who stand up and say, I'm an intersex person, and they identify as an intersex person. And that's happened in the 30 years I've been doing this work. And I think that using media and being seen as a big population, we are as common as people with red hair. We are the most common congenital difference. Right? The most common congenital difference. Yet we are unknown. We are not seen as a large community in this society, but we are, and we have been as long as there has been recorded history. We're first beginning to be known. We have initial characters on television shows. We have people who are out as intersex all over the place now. Many, many different faces, many, many broad ranges of ages. And God, I'm thankful for that, because this used to be so highly stigmatized, and from the standpoint of the medical community, still is so highly stigmatized that it must be corrected at birth. And I think that the more of us that come out and say, hey, we're intersex people, a few of us escaped surgery, we had parents who weren't willing to have weren't willing to have surgeons cut them up. We were raised in countries where they didn't have that kind of medical capability. These are the people who are going to be able to go forward and say, I am better off for having the genitals I was born with. Besides all of us who've been shouting for so many years saying, I hate what was done to me. Now we have a fair number of people who can say, I was spared this suffering, and I'm very glad for it.
Just to back up what you're saying, the most recent figures I've read, 1 in 100 births in this country are intersex, either based on some organ, some chemistry, something at DNA level, chromosomal level, that sort of thing. So yeah, way fucking common.
Yes, we exist. We have a right to exist.
Would you call, now you made a distinction saying intersex is not trans. It's not transgender, but could it be seen as trans, as people who, as opposed to transgender?
Right, because people, I don't identify as male or female. I bitch about the fact of being called male or female. And I correct audiences and people in my own life about that all the time. You know, I wear this costume like David was talking about because of what it gets us. It gets us an easier life.
Yeah.
You know, that's what it gets us. But are we all transgendered? Are we all differently gendered? I identify as intersex. I don't identify as male or female. I identify as intersex because I want intersex people to be seen as a viable aspect of this culture. Not something that needs to be fixed or changed. There are intersex people who have a right to exist.
Thank you. Would you see it as an insult if I said intersex people could be included under a trans umbrella?
Not at all.
Yeah. Okay.
So many people have this strict discrimination in their mind. Trans people want surgery.
Yeah. Trans, nah.
See?
Yeah.
So I work with trans people all the time. I try to get them to understand that they can do whatever they like with their physical appearance. It's how they identify that's important. It used to be that we had standards of care that said people must go through the surgery and the hormones to be identified as trans. Remember this? And that all stopped. And now people can do whatever surgeries they want. They can do whatever hormones they want. They can dress as they please. They can identify as they please. They can change many places. They can change their driver's license, their birth certificates. All this stuff is progress during the time we've been alive.
Well, we have to wrap it up in about 15-ish minutes, so I want to open up to questions from you guys out there. And I don't know, Galila, ¿quisieras estar disponible para contestar preguntas? ¿Quieres venir a hacer? So I don't know if anyone has a particular reason you want to.
Yeah, you can already see. I am curious about the pronoun that millennials seem to use they, which in the way that we're talking about gender, I'm not even sure, satisfies the idea of not being one or the other. And is there an American pronoun for potentially the third gender, is another way to say it, or something else other than they? And I'm curious how the panel has embraced or functions around they, or the use of need for a pronoun other than the way Tara talked about using it.
I use they. I prefer they. I don't mind if people refer to me as she or her. The best explanation, first off, they, before 1600, before dictionaries, they was an acceptable gender-free third-person pronoun. Yeah, they're coming over to the house. We even use it. A lot of people use it anyway. But the best explanation I've heard from a non-binary person of why they use they was a 12-year-old child. And they said that, of course I'm they. And yes, they is plural, but I am a boy. That's one. And I am a girl. That's two. I am plural. That's they. And I think in the same way that the culture has had to get along with Ms., the culture is going to have to get along with they.
And I prefer they, them, their. I was telling you a story earlier. I'm going to be speaking at a big national conference of the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists in a month. And the conference organizer asked me what we could do to make the conferees more aware about gender differences and gender nonconformity stuff. And I said, well, we could have gender non-specific bathrooms, which I was told that the local ordinances wouldn't allow. And then I said, well, you could ask people to be sensitive to pronouns. So we're going to ask people what pronouns they prefer. And she asked me straight out, what do you prefer? I said, well, I use they, them, their. And we were on a telephone conversation. She wrote back to me in an email, and she spelled their T-H-E-R-E. So I wrote back to her and said T-H-E-I-R. And she said, oh God, I'm so embarrassed. Okay, but she should have been. She should have been. When I have close friends who know me well, know my story well, have been following what I've been doing all these years, I like them to use female pronouns in relationship to me, especially in public. Because I think the corrective is important. I don't identify as female. But when people hear people who are close to me opening doors for me, or offering me a seat, or calling me, her, all these other things, it's like, I think that's great. I want people to think, huh? I want them to be questioning that stuff very strongly.
I think I spoke to it. I ask people what their preferred gender norm is and follow the, Mine was just to articulate an in-between, because at that time, no one was using their them. And then it stuck.
And I'll also say, if somebody calls me he, I don't spend a lot of time correcting the general public, because I know this is what I look like. It's the suit I wear, and I don't think it's really useful to correct a person working at a counter when they use a pronoun that I don't agree with, but it fits for the tyranny of their eyes. It fits for their perception.
With similar to Tiger, I'll be like, my sister says sister about me, and I like that because I feel like her sister. And so she will say, my sister, he's whatever. And I'm like, that's appropriate. Like, I feel like your sister. So similarly to Tiger, I like that confusion and identify as her sister, he. So that's the only thing I can add to that.
I think I'm more curious about whether or not the they, why they as opposed to particularly coming up with another pronoun or some kind of slang or something that would sort of, instead of, it still feels like it's posing the binary of one or the other and then a plus, right, of being both, as opposed to being not both, but something else. Do you know what I'm saying?
They is non-gender specific, and just non-gender specific.
I think that's the harder one for most people, I think, that it still feels plural, or it's, But I love what you said about the history of it and kind of reminding people of the early use of they.
And I was going to say something.
Mucho gusto. Disculpas, solo hablo español y estoy en un país donde solo hablo inglés.
I speak Spanish and I'm in an English-speaking country.
Es mi primera experiencia en la ciudad de Nueva York. Es un placer poder compartir con ustedes.
New York, and it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Respondiendo a la pregunta en relación a mi comunidad de mujeres trans,
Responding to the question in relationship to my community of trans women.
pues nosotras al nacer biológicamente nacemos con un sexo con el cual no nos identificamos.
We were born with a sex that we did not identify with biologically.
Y pues como podrán ver, uno de los pequeños avances que tenemos en mi país
One of the small advances that we have in my country
es que al día de hoy podemos tomarnos nuestra fotografía con nuestra identidad de género.
is that today we can take our portrait for the documents and IDs with our preferred gender expression.
Pero con relación al nombre legal, tanto mi comunidad como mi persona no nos identificamos con ello.
But in relationship to the legal name, both I and my community do not identify with it.
De hecho, cuando hacemos alguna transacción bancaria, por ejemplo,
In fact, when we go to do a bank transaction, for example,
me pasó ahora en el aeropuerto, pues lastimosamente tengo un nombre masculino con el cual no me identifico.
it just happened to me at the airport. I have a masculine name with which I do not identify.
Si gustan verlo, lo pasaré por ahí.
If you want to see it, I can pass it around.
Y pues ese es un derecho que se nos ha negado
That's a
como
right that
mujeres
has
trans.
been denied as trans women.
Y pues estamos en una lucha iniciando a trabajar en un borrador de la ley de identidad de género.
We are beginning to work on a draft for the gender identity law.
Y pues estamos en proceso de poder consensuarlo con la comunidad trans en Guatemala.
And we're in the process of working on this with the trans community in Guatemala.
Por el momento, muchas de mis compañeras lo que hemos hecho es a nivel personal cambiarnos el nombre con recursos propios.
What we have done at a personal level, me and some of my friends, is to change our names with our own, through our own resources.
Pero lastimosamente no todas nosotras tenemos acceso a tener estos recursos por ser en mi país la mayoría de compañeras trans de escasos recursos.
But unfortunately, we don't all have access to this possibility because most of us have low resources, income resources.
En este momento en mi país un cambio de nombre legal a nivel personal está costando alrededor de 5,000 quetzales.
In my country, to change our names legally costs 5,000 quetzales.
Y pues ese es el proceso que les puedo contar. Muchas quisiéramos optar al cambio de nombre porque la ley de identidad de género aún es un sueño en mi país.
So that's the process I can tell you about. Although plenty of us would like or are aiming for to change our names because, and this is only going to be accomplished through the gender identity law, but that's still a dream in my country.
Y pues he conseguido un pequeño proyecto piloto en la cual algunas compañeras entre mi persona nos estamos cambiando el nombre y ya en 2 meses pues yo seré Grecia Galilea Monroy de León.
But there is a pilot project that I'm starting where in 2 months I will be able to change my name legally and my name is going to be Grecia Galilea León.
Muchas gracias.
Any other questions from the audience?
I just want to wrap my head around this because I think it's really interesting to talk about. Use the word costume and disguise, and talked about the way in which we're all impacted by that kind of tyranny, which I agree with, and to lesser and more degree, I'm sure aware of how we sort of factor ourselves into that, for better or for worse. Can you talk about how it feels then for you? You know, you said I'm a white male doctor, doesn't get any better than that. Can you just talk about, I mean, that must be a complicated thing, right? Then to assume the kind of privilege that you know is sort of enacted by the tyranny at the same time as you want to work against it. And I just wondered if you would talk about that. I think anyone on the panel can speak to that to some degree. How we do or don't identify with what we put forward and how we do or don't benefit from that. So you in particular, just because you've used the words disguise and costume, but also you said that you've chosen basically to, it's an old word past, but it's a word that we still have to think about a little bit, right? So can you just comment on that a little bit?
2 pieces. I work in Las Vegas, and in Las Vegas, women are trophies. They are property of their husbands. I've never been in the city before, and I've worked in a lot of places in the United States. Women in Las Vegas have every kind of plastic surgery you can imagine. They have their breasts done, their hips done, their waist done, their boobs done, under part of their arms done. They have everything done. And that is a tyranny. That is something that women are made to do. I don't think women want to have all that surgery. I really don't. I think that if it's important to your husband and you're dependent upon your husband has to show you off as something, that you'll go do it, right? Because that's what your marriage demands. I think that's horrible. Right? When I first started doing this, I was the only one was the only one, and I knew that I had to have a position of a certain kind of power that would give me credibility and privilege, and that would allow me access to be able to be seen as somebody who would be listened to. A PhD from Hopkins, blah, blah, you know, all that stuff opened a lot of doors for me. All these kids and their kids who are coming up now and identifying as intersex, they can wear whatever they want, they can cut their hair how they like, they can give themselves names that don't have any kind of gender relationship at all. Tiger was lucky for me. There's a wonderful intersex activist right now. Their name is Pigeon, right? And I think it's great that they choose that kind of name. Now, I think that more people can come out and be very gender different and be okay in general society. I was born in 1958. I'm 57. I don't think that would have worked in my 20s and 30s. I think I would have been so marginalized as to hardly have existed. And I think it was the timing in my life that was necessary for me to pull this off that really kind of forced those choices upon me because of what I wanted to do with my life.
I guess last year, actually, in this room, I participated in this event where we were talking about voice, and one of my friend colleagues talked about his work as a composer and vocal coach, and then showed a video of somebody who was altering their voice as part of this talent, right? This ability to, pass, for lack of a better word, which I was sort of embarrassed not to even have considered before and thought it was amazing as a talent that is not really discussed in terms of the ability to, identify as however you like, and how much of that, I guess this is to Tiger, how much of that is incorporated into the therapy at this point? I mean, obviously it's something that is chosen, but is there a growth in terms of the people that want to address voice in the same way as the other parts of their body?
Please excuse me, I have to go. Thank you for letting me be part of this. Thank you.
Like with transsexual people, I think there's much less pressure to have to adhere to anything that is gender normative or binary normative. So people get the chance to be able to do all kinds of different stuff now that they couldn't do before. I can't tell you how many testosterone shots I've given in my own butt. I mean, really, it's horrible.
Did you say you had how many testosterone shots?
I've had to give myself in my own butt.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, I don't know, 40 years of this, it's crazy, right? And those hormones aren't good for me. They weren't made by my body. They were made in a lab someplace, you know? So, yeah, I mean, this affected my voice and did all the other stuff it does to my body. Would I have liked to have not had to do that? Yeah, except for the stuff I just talked about, historical context. So I think that many intersex people now, they can wear much more gender non-specific clothing, they can have much more gender non-specific voice, gender non-specific naming, gender non-specific haircuts, gender non-specific vocational choices, all kinds of stuff that just wasn't possible when I was a young person.
Tiger has a portrait, and I watched it. And when I was watching it, I was like, oh, white male doctor. I was totally doing it in front of you. And I told them that I was watching this, and that was my initial response. And then they later say, they talk about how they have costume, how they present. But they also say, I need people like who are gender non-conforming. I need you. And I do think it's really important that you say that, and also that I had that reaction and I was wrong. I like that, you know? Like I catch myself in my own policing, right? And so I think that that part's important, that, because I understand why you would want to mask and use that privilege. But I do think that, I wonder about, like, and this may be getting off topic, but how women react to gender non-conforming bodies and their feminism. and I wonder how you hold on to, and it's interesting how you can hold on to, men can be feminists, I get it, but like wear this costume and be a feminist and have that history with, have that lived history is so exciting to me.
Yeah.
And I feel like that can't be excluded from your practice and your therapy. Like, you know what it is to have lived that experience.
Well, there's two parts to that. You're right when I speak about how it is that I want people to be gender outrageous. I want them to wear crazy clothes and do all kinds of stuff that really confuse people all the time. I need them to do that, and I also say as long as they can.
Yes, you do.
Okay? Until they can't afford it anymore, right? Until they can't afford to be that outrageous and still be employable and have enough money to eat and have shelter. And I say very, very simply, I mean, I was a club kid in my 20s, believe it or not, and, when I went out to clubs, I wore women's lingerie and sparkly boots with rhinestones.
Oh, rhinestones.
Yeah, that was me. That was me going out to clubs. And I need you to know that even in the 80s when I was doing that, there were a lot of club-type people who were like, they didn't like what they saw, but the club owners did.
Right.
Okay? And I was one of the first, remember how long ago this was, I was one of those first boys on the box, and they loved that I was genderqueer. And they loved that I screwed it up like that. And I did too. But when I got my PhD, I couldn't do that anymore. Because I can't dance like that in front of my patients. Because I would have no practice. That's why.
Maybe now you can.
Maybe now I could. With the amount of out I've been, maybe now I could.
I think that's a realistic.
I'm not so sure I look so good with Teddy anymore.
Well, unfortunately, we have to go, but if you want to hang out maybe outside and ask more questions, Carla, I know you had a question, we'll be around for a moment. Thank you so much, all of you, for participating.
Aquí me quedó mi pasaporte, por favor. Si no, no puedo salir de su país.